This episode of Tales from Atlantis is brought to you by Atlantis Premium. Don't you just hate having your favorite podcast interrupted by ads like this? Well, dear listener, you're in luck. Because starting at just $3 a month, you can support independent Chicano media and receive ad-free episodes, premium episodes, bonus content, and access to our Discord server. Just visit talesfromatlantis.com and click Go Premium, or follow the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show. Representation matters. But as indigenous Chicano people, we can't just sit back and wait for mainstream media outlets to make it happen for us. And nor should we. We started the Tales from Atlantis podcast because we believe that it is imperative for Chicanos, Chicanas, and Chicanx people to produce our own media and tell our own stories. And the way we choose to do this is by using Buzzsprout to host the podcast. Buzzsprout is by far the easiest and best way to launch a professional podcast. You'll get a podcast website, audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and much more. To start your own podcast and get a $20 Amazon gift card, follow the link in the show notes. This lets Buzzsprout know that we sent you and helps support the show. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. Now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so, and why that's so, and why that's so, and why that's so.
Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Tales from Atlantis. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa.
And Ruben Arellano Tlacatecat.
So how are you doing tonight, sir?
I am doing fine. Why, thank you for asking.
Happy birthday, by the way.
Hey, thanks. When is yours?
June 13th. It's
June
coming
13th. All right. Excellent. I need to mark it on my calendar.
It's almost here, my friend.
You going to throw a big shindig? I know you've done some big ones in the past.
We usually throw a very, very large birthday party, and we usually get at least 100 people, and the cops always show up to shut us down. So we'll see. I don't know. I mean, with the pandemic and all, if I do it, it'll be way scaled down. I don't know if we're going to do it, though.
Haven't you heard? Pandemic's over.
Yeah. Well, it's fake. It's a plandemic, bro. It's a scamdemic. So today we're going to be talking about some New Mexican history, and it's something that I enjoy bringing up on this show every once in a while, being that my family has deep roots here in the state of New Mexico. And if you've lived here for any amount of time, you know that acequias, or ditches, most people just know them as ditches, right, are a big and vibrant part of New Mexican heritage because they have a lot to do with how water is allocated, how water is resourced and distributed and used by acequia communities to grow their food. So acequias are life in many parts of New Mexico.
What about the ditch witches? How do they relate to this?
La Llorona? We've got our local version of La Llorona, the ditch witch, as the white citizens of New Mexico like to call her. The ditch witch.
The ditch
That's
witch.
Funny. I actually haven't heard that in a while. That was big when I was like in high school. I think they were really trying to push that, beware of the ditch witch, and we were like, you mean La Llorona? Like, why are you what are you doing? I think they finally just gave up because I haven't seen it.
It didn't catch on?
No, thank goodness.
Well, hopefully this episode will put that back on the map.
Fingers crossed. Acequias, a forgotten history. The acequia is a communal irrigation ditch, and its continued use is a testament to the cultural resiliency of the New Mexican people. But where does this tradition come from? Sadly, most New Mexicans have a distorted understanding of acequia history and credit its creation solely to Moors and Spaniards. For example, a recent article in National Geographic frames the origins of New Mexican acequias as follows.
This communal water system traces its roots to the Spanish conquistadors who brought their traditions to the territory in the 1600s and who themselves borrowed it from the Muslims who invaded Spain in the 8th century. Indeed, the word acequia, pronounced acequia, stress on the sa, is an adaptation of the Arabic as sikaya, sakia, not sure, meaning water carrier.
I think it's Acequia, but I don't speak Arabic. But is this really true? Well, as Captain Kirk would say, but that's not the way it happened. In fact, there is way more to the story. You see, when the Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica in 1519, they encountered civilizations that were thousands of years old. These civilizations gave rise to exquisite works of art, philosophies, monolithic architecture, systems of government, schools, libraries, and of course, highly developed systems of agriculture. One of the hallmarks of Mesoamerican agriculture was a system of irrigation ditches and canals known as apantli, or apantle, depending on the variety of Nahuatl that you speak. The apantli formed a network of irrigation ditches that were fed by the Way Apantli, or the Great Canal, which was used to distribute water to individual fields, or milpas. Now, I should mention that irrigation ditches were also in use at this time throughout the Americas. The Hohokam in Arizona built a vast system of irrigation ditches, and the ancestral Puebloans of New Mexico also had developed systems of water governance. For example, some communities used the apantli as part of their name, which was expressed visually in Mesoamerican text by a drawing of the cross-section of an irrigation ditch along with a phonogrammic symbol. So basically you would get these communities that would name themselves, for example, from the Codex Mendoza, we have Awilisapan, Totolapan, and Acocospan. And these are all from the Codex Mendoza. And the way that the name is written using the Mexica style is the cross-section of a ditch, and then you had the other symbols. So, for example, Awilisapan means apantle happiness place, right? So it has like this guy sitting in an apantle holding his hands up, like really happy. Totolapan is like the bird apantli, so the symbol is of a bird sitting on an apantli.
So the pan part of that word comes from pantli, which means banner, and so in effect, they're making a metaphorical analogy to a banner that's kind of long.
Yes, something straight, right? So the apantli, these irrigation networks, were straight and rigid. So apantli, exactly like you said, they had this connection to something that was straight and rigid.
Nice.
Perhaps the best depiction of the vast network of apantli that stretched across Mexico Tenochtitlan is the Uppsala map. In this map, we see just how deeply this agricultural technology was ingrained into the social fabric of a Mesoamerican city-state. And I'm going to put the Uppsala map in the show notes so that our listeners can see it for themselves. But basically, it's a map showing a section. Well, it's showing Mexico Tenochtitlan, but then you can also see all of the various irrigation ditches that are running out of it and into it. Because remember, they had these massive canals, right, that were being brought into the city to bring in drinking water. So the Apantli, the irrigation ditch, massive part of life in Mesoamerica. When the Spanish first saw the Apantli, they were reminded of the irrigation ditches they had seen used by the Moors, which they knew as Acequia. The rest, as they say, is history. The Spanish simply chose to refer to the Apantli with a term that was more familiar to them, and an ancient Mesoamerican technology was rebranded with an Arabic name. Don't believe me? Well, let's take a look at the entry for Apantli in Alonso de Molina's 1571 Nahuatl Language Dictionary.
Apantli, Acequia de agua.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Have you picked up your Mexica calendar for the year 12 Flint? Or how about a paperback copy of The Four Disagreements? Just visit talesfromatlantis.com for all the latest merchandise and show some love for your favorite podcast. That's talesfromatlantis.com for all the latest merchandise. Now, back to the show. The importance of the Apantli in Mesoamerican agriculture is made abundantly clear in Book 6 of the Florentine Codex. This book, which contains the Huehuetlahtoli, or the ancient word, relates the moral philosophies which guided the lives of citizens of Mexico Tenochtitlan. For example,
and especially take care of the ridge, of the ditch, plant and sow in the field.
And
perhaps thou wilt make well the ridges of land, the canals.
So once again, these are all from Book 6 of the Florentine Codex. Later, the Spanish enlisted thousands of Nahuatl-speaking Tlaxcaltecas and Mexicas to colonize New Mexico, and they brought with them this Mesoamerican agricultural technology. The introduction of the Apantli system into New Mexico is discussed in the book Thinking Like a Watershed.
Oñate knew that in order for the new settlement to thrive and survive, water was needed. According to Dr. Tomás Martínez Saldaña, agricultural historian from Mexico City, who has done a lot of work on the role of the Tlaxcalas in the settlement of the northern frontier of New Spain, it was the Tlaxcaltecas who were instrumental in helping lay out the Acequia system in what is now New Mexico. To be fair, irrigation was also taking place in the southwest, as evidenced by the great canals uncovered near present-day Phoenix. And this is by Juan Esteban Arellano.
You guys related?
Not
Maybe.
that I know of, but perhaps distant
Perhaps.
relations.
As noted in the National Geographic article mentioned at the beginning of this episode, Acequia culture remains a vibrant and important aspect of New Mexican cultural identity, but sadly, its Mesoamerican origins remain largely ignored. Most historians simply repeat the myth told by National Geographic. The Acequia is purely an old world invention. Now, the point of this episode is not to say that Acequias are solely an invention of Mesoamerica, nor to discount the Moorish and Spanish contributions to Acequia governance, but there already exists a preponderance of information detailing that part of the history. I simply hope to make the Mesoamerican contributions to Acequia development more well known. If you scratch just beneath the surface, the Mesoamerican origins of New Mexico's Acequias become visible. For example, the term apantle is still used by many in northern New Mexico to describe parts of the Acequia system. The term tapanco, a small temporary dam used to divert streams of water, is also of Mesoamerican origin, from the Nahuatl language. It comes from the Nahuatl word tlapantli, which is a heap or a pile. But perhaps my favorite is the term tequio, a word in the Nahuatl language used to describe a traditional indigenous system of communal social organization and labor. Here in New Mexico, this word is used to describe the communal act of cleaning the acequias. So in northern New Mexico, where they say this weekend we're having a tequio, it literally means we all have to get together this weekend and we're all going to help each other clean out the acequia.
And that's part of the ancient Castilian Spanish?
Yeah, right? I'll bet you anything there's somebody that thinks that tequio is like an ancient Castilian word. I swear, man. However you choose to slice it, Acequia communities in New Mexico are as much an extension of Mesoamerican institutions as they are of Arabic and Spanish institutions. Most Chicanas and Chicanos with roots running deep in New Mexico descend from the Mesoamericans who helped settle this state. And if we take the time to look, we can see the imprint left by our indigenous ancestors all around us. It is in the food we eat, the language we use, the customs we practice, our connection to the land, and the agricultural heritage held dear by so many New Mexicans. It is in us. We only need to look.
The magic was always in you, Kurly. I knew it.
It wasn't a magic acequia at all.
You know what bugs me about this article by the National Geographic?
Nat Geo, yeah.
Is that by them giving credit to the Moors via the Spanish, in a sense, aren't they also kind of adding a little bit of fuel to that whole Black Olmec myth? Because isn't that one of the things that these people, they latch on to these terms like Moor and what's the other one that's used to describe the pyramids? What was the word that the Spanish used?
Mosques. They would say that the temples were mosques and queues, whatever queues are.
And these people don't understand that the reason why the Spanish used those terms is because they had no frame of reference other than the Moors, whom they were already fighting back in Spain when they were reconquistando España, right? Mm-hmm. And so they used those very same terms that they were using to describe the Moors back in the old world to describe things that they were witnessing in the new world, because they had no other way to describe it.
Exactly. And that's even how they got the word acequia, right?
Exactly.
So they were familiar with the acequia system. So they saw the Mexicas and the Tlaxcaltecas and the Totonacos and everybody else that they were encountering using similar systems of irrigation and governance. And they were like, oh, these are just like the acequias that the Moors use. Mm-hmm. So we'll just call them acequias.
Right.
And even then they would call them the bows and arrows, right? They would call them Turkish bows and arrows. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the temples they referred to as mosques. And if you were, of a particular shade of skin color, they're like, oh, they're like a Turk. Mm-hmm. They're like a Moor. And so they used their frame of reference. And what these pseudo-historians and pseudo-scholars do, they push this distorted, bizarre racial fantasy that, no, these are referencing the Moors, referring to like the Black Moors, and claiming they were the Native Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's like this weird distortion of history. And yeah, when National Geographic does stuff like this, it kind of feeds into that. There's that comic book. It's a web comic called Aztec Empire. It's a really cool comic book. I'm a fan of it. But there's one section where Cortez, and I don't know if it's Cortez or if it's just like some random Spanish captain, but he's talking about an indigenous woman, and he's like, I'm going to have my way with this Moor, right? And to their credit, I reached out to the creators of this comic book, and I was like, people are going to latch onto that, and they're going to distort it, and they're going to try to make it seem like the Spaniards were talking about, the Moors, like the Moors, mm-hmm. and that that the real indigenous people are Moors. So the creators of the comic book actually, because the thing I like about that comic book is it has citations and endnotes. And so they put a little citation number in that issue when he says that. And at the end, in the endnotes, it addresses that. And it says, this is, they use the word Moor for the following reasons. And so I thought that was really cool. They didn't have to do that, but at least I got them to change that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and who from Nat Geo, like, they're not going to know any better, right? Because one of the problems with mainstream academia and archaeology and stuff is you tell people, like, hey, there's this whole group of people out there who think that the Moors, they call themselves Moors, they're African Americans, but they call themselves Moors, and they claim that they're the real Native Americans. And so when you use these words, they latch onto them and they distort them. But academics and historians, archaeologists look at that and they're like, what a bunch of idiots, like, that's nonsense. But they don't address it. They're like, well, this is nonsense. Why would we even give that the time of day to counter that? And since they're not countering that, what they're doing is they're creating this void that's being filled with pseudoscience and pseudo-history and nonsensical bullshit.
Well, because addressing these things isn't going to get them tenure, isn't going to advance their careers.
Exactly, right?
They don't care.
You've got a finite amount of time to dedicate to your studies and your research. So why would you? But luckily, we have guys like, Ken Feder, and David Anderson, who are badass archaeologists who make it their point to counter pseudo-archaeological
Have they written anything
claims.
on this? I'd like to read some of whatever they've written.
Well, Ken's book,
I have his book.
I don't know if he covers it.
Let me see.
The Frauds and Mysteries one?
I have, I think, the 3rd edition of that book.
I have the 7th edition.
Oh, there's a 7th edition? God.
Well, there's even a later one, too. Like, he puts out one often because he's constantly updating
it. Okay.
But what's great is I think he does. I know he references the whole Black Olmec myth.
Do you know what chapter it's in?
I'm going to be honest with you, man. I do not.
Okay. Yeah, because
I did see it in here.
All right. Well, I guess I'll find it eventually. I mean, I've been trying to make my way through this book, but
The thing I like about it is it gives you these little critical thinking exercises at the end of each chapter. So, like, for example, he has critical thinking exercise. Using the deductive approach outlined in Chapter 2, how would you test these hypotheses? So,
Chapter 6,
makes you work.
Africans in Ancient America, Afrocentrism, Africans in Ancient America, The Verdict, page 110 on my edition.
That's Chapter 6?
Yeah, Chapter 6. After the Indians, before Columbus. So good on him. Good on Ken for that.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm going to have to definitely read that part because we need to circle back to that topic because it's becoming problematic.
Oh, absolutely. I'm actually writing up an episode about it. And it would be great to have somebody like Ken on the show, too. I've reached out to him before, and he said he's interested.
Oh, cool. Ken, if you're listening,
please come on the show. Well, speaking of Ken, I just watched a great documentary on Amazon called Science Friction. Have you heard of that one?
I have heard of it. I haven't watched it yet.
It's Brian Dunning's documentary. It's good.
Is it?
Yeah, it's got Ben Radford's in it.
Good old Ben.
Ken is in it. David Anderson is in it. And basically, it's about how shows like the History Channel will invite legitimate archaeologists and historians on to give their shows this veneer of credibility, but then they just edit whatever they say, to make it sound like they're backing up the narrative of the show.
Any Chicanos on that show?
No, and Brian Dunning actually told me, because he'd heard about this little operation that I was involved with, and he was like, if you were still doing that, if we were still editing, I would have asked you to participate.
Okay. Well, at least they're trying to reach out. So good.
Yeah.
Maybe next round.
Well, speaking of which, this thing that I'm in comes out tomorrow.
Is it tomorrow?
So, tomorrow night.
Whoa. And it's on the History Channel?
I'm not. I don't know. It's on a channel.
It's on a channel,
and the name of the channel is a mystery. It rhymes with mystery. You could say it's a mystery channel.
Okay.
I'm just not sure what I'm allowed to say outside of the bounds of what I signed before the show comes out. Right. But once the show is out, I can.
Well, by the time this episode airs, it's going to be after the show comes out.
That's true. Yeah, that's right. So if you're listening to this, the show will have already come out
a week before,
like a week ago.
Yep.
Yeah. But I want to do it as its own episode. I want it to be.
Oh yeah, we're not going to talk about it today. No. We're supposed to be talking about Acequias.
That's true. One of the things with Acequias that's happening here in New Mexico that's really interesting is so the state of New Mexico just legalized weed.
Legalize it.
And I'm not against it, right? I think of course, weed should be legal. But what's happened is all of these like right-wing politicians had already positioned themselves to take advantage of the legalization of weed. So like you have all these former cops and shit that were jailing people for smoking weed just last year, but they were already investing in and getting, because they saw the writing on the walls, right? They're like, weed's going to get legalized. We need to be on the ground floor. And so now you've got this situation where the majority of money that's going to be made by the people setting up these companies, it's all going to be out-of-staters, and it's all going to be like former cops and shit. It's pretty whack.
Damn.
But the other big thing is it's actually going to harm, in my opinion. I mean, maybe it won't, we'll see. Time will tell. But I think that it's going to harm, in a lot of ways, traditional Acequia communities, because this water has to come from somewhere for this weed. And New Mexico's in a drought, man. New Mexico's in a hardcore drought. And the Acequias themselves, I have friends in Acequia communities who are like, we're already hurting. Like, there's already not enough water going around. I think what happened was everybody was so eager to legalize weed that maybe they didn't
think it through,
do like a big picture analysis of how this was going to affect ultimately Chicano indigenous communities, in New Mexico, or could get hurt by this. So we were hurt by it when it was illegal, and now we're going to be hurt by it when it's legal.
When does it take effect, this new law?
Oh, it's already kicked in.
Oh, it's already kicked in.
This month. So I think on the 1st, April 1st.
Wow. Okay.
So it's been 18 days.
So have they commuted people's sentences who were thrown in jail and prison?
Honestly, I don't know, but I would hope that that's something that's
retroactively
under discussion, right?
Go back and commute sentences and stuff.
That should happen. Shit. How much would that suck if you're doing time right now for selling weed in a state
that now
legalize weed?
Yeah. I'd be pissed.
Yeah, I'd be pretty angry. So yeah, that's an unfortunate consequence.
So what exactly, so you have acequias, you have a traditional system of ditches that existed prior to the arrival of the Mexica and the Tlaxcaltecas, and then they bring in their version of it. How different was it from, for example, the pre-existing Hohokam and the one that was brought in from central Mexico, like those irrigation systems?
That's a good question. I don't have a precise answer, but I would think, just from what I've seen of the way that the Hohokam irrigation systems were set up, they were pretty similar. The general idea being you have your Acequia Madre, right? Or in Nahuatl, the Way Apantli. Same concept. So you had your primary Acequia that carried the water, and then you had individual Acequias coming off of it that were used by individuals or groups of individuals. Mm-hmm. So everybody was allotted their portion of water, and it was all distributed equitably, and everybody was responsible for maintaining the Acequia.
I think I remember seeing that what you're describing in action in that documentary from, I think it was the 80s, called Milagro Beanfield War.
The groundbreaking documentary, ethnographic. Did they have Acequias in that movie? I haven't seen that movie in forever.
Yeah,
I would imagine they would.
There's a scene at the end where the bean field gets water from somewhere miraculously. I don't know how.
That's right. That movie sucked.
It was representing your state, man. Come on. You got to give it some props. Growing up, I didn't have a lot of frame of reference as to New Mexico culture, but that was one, it's like, give me an idea what to expect whenever if I ever went.
Bless me ultima.
Yeah, bless me ultima. Well, that wasn't a movie. It was a book. It became a movie eventually, like 10 years ago or something like that?
Something like that with an all Puerto Rican cast.
Is that what that's weird, right? Like, fucking hell, I swear. But I'm not even going to get into that.
Yeah. But yeah, you know what? To be in all honesty, it's been so long since I've seen Milagro Beanfield War that I should probably give it another shot. Like, check it out. The problem with, and I'll just say, and I want this to be its own episode too, sometime in the future. I would like to get some Chicanos and Chicanas working in the film industry on the show. But as a Chicano who used to participate a lot in the film industry, I can tell you, man, those old Chicano movies, most of them, like 80% of them, are just fucking corny. Like, they're just corny, man. They're cheeseball.
All right, so you have the Milagro Beanfield War. What else? What else was corny?
Mi Familia. That's like
Mi Familia.
That's corny to the extreme. Yeah, man.
I can see that. Yeah.
And what else? I mean, there was like a whole slew of just, Edward James Olmos involved movies that came out around that.
How do I reach these kids?
Fill the hole.
Hey, Fingerman.
You know what? He played a main character in 2 really good movies, though. So I got to give him that.
Okay.
And he was in Blade Runner. So
that's right. Blade Runner. That's a classic.
That's a badass movie. But he was in The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez.
Yep. That was also Luis Valdez's production, right?
That was dope. And Zoot Suit. I mean, that movie goes hard, man.
It does.
I love that movie.
The thing about Zoot Suit is it doesn't get the credit that it deserves for what it was at the time.
It doesn't.
And there's a show that's going to go nameless, but it's a nationally syndicated so-called Latino show about Latino things. And a few years ago...
Latino things.
Yeah. They did an episode where they talked about, quote-unquote, Latin theater. And they focused on the East Coast, as usual. It's because it's, that's the focus of the show.
It's like West Side Story, stuff like that.
Yeah, and never once did Zoot Suit get a name drop in that entire episode for being not only, quote-unquote, a Latino, right, if you want to categorize it as such, play that was actually exhibited in Broadway. I mean, it had a whole run in Broadway, right, before it was made into a movie. And I'm thinking... seriously? Like, you're going to talk about all these other plays and you're not even going to mention the one Chicano?
Yeah. Well, the positives and negatives of that are the negative is they left it out of the discussion entirely. They erased it. The positive is Chicanos didn't get associated with Latinos.
Exactly.
So that's
that's
so maybe
that's the silver lining of
I just remember watching that as a kid, my mom being like so hyped that it was on VHS and like bringing it home because she had always told me the story because I'm from this barrio called Dog Patch in Pueblo, Colorado, right? And she would always talk about this guy that she went to high school with or was in like a class below her who was a dancer who was in Zoot Suit.
Okay.
And
interesting.
And I don't know if he was like in the stage version or the movie or whatever. I was young. I didn't even know what Zoot Suit was. But she was so happy. She brought it home. She was stoked, man. And then we watched that and it had an effect on me. Like I swole with like pride watching that movie as a kid, like seeing all these Chicanos. And when the dad is like, when you join the Navy, are you going to promise me you'll take that damn thing off and, you know, and throw it away. But he's like, it's Chicano style, Dad. And he's like, don't call yourself that. But I was like,
Haven't I told you not to use that word?
Yeah, I told you not to use that word. Or when Olmos is like, don't try to outpachuco me, ese. I used to go around the house like saying that to my mom and everybody in the family. Don't try to outpachuco me, ese. That's a badass movie.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that we kind of made our way to Zoot Suit in this episode of Acequia. The entire episode of the Zoot Suit and the story that it's based around the Zoot Suit riots and the Sleepy Lagoon trial, you know, that's usually focused on California. California and Los Angeles wasn't the only place that had Zoot Suiters and riots. Just saying, that can be an episode at some point.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I mean, the Sleepy Lagoon. Now, think about this. Was that part of an Acequia system as well? The Sleepy Lagoon?
I don't know. You know what? It's interesting that you bring that up because I had just started to read an article about Sleepy Lagoon a couple of days ago. And I only got the abstract read, so I have to finish the article. But it'll be interesting. Because I know they do reference like where the lagoon was located, because it wasn't called Sleepy Lagoon. Like Sleepy Lagoon is the name that the Chicanos gave it.
Yeah.
And it's because they would go, oh no, you know what it was? It was a dam, because that's where they would go swim, because Mexicans weren't allowed in the swimming pools.
Swimming pools, that's right. Yeah.
So they would go swim at this dam, and they called it Sleepy Lagoon because there was like a Pachuco song that referenced Sleepy Lagoon somewhere. So all the Chicanos started calling it Sleepy Lagoon after the song.
Got it. Well, I mean, I bring that up because some years ago, this is going back quite a few years actually, when I was doing some research for, I don't know if it was maybe it was my dissertation. I came across a reference to a creek or something similar to a creek, maybe like a little, like a ravine or something, but it was up in like in the Bay Area, just east of Oakland, somewhere in that area. And it was called Temescal or Temescales or something like that. And I've always been curious about where that name came from because that's very far up north, even for California, for something like that to have the name of Temescal associated with some natural, body of water. And I don't know if maybe there might be some sort of connection with like an Acequia system in that area. So I wasn't sure if maybe you had ever heard of that, or I wanted to run it by you. I've always wanted to ask you. It's never come up before. It's actually the first time that it's come up in conversation. And so I just wanted to run it by you, see what you thought about that.
No, I haven't heard of it. That's something that you should look into.
Okay. So what else can we say about these acequias? What are they good for?
Well, when I lived down in Peralta, New Mexico, and you came and visited once, my parents' house.
I do remember that.
There.
Yeah.
And so we had an acequia that ran right along the side of our house. And so I would have to go out there and open it up to get water, because my mom would always grow, she had a big garden, right? So we would use the acequia, but we weren't allowed a whole lot of water. So we used, because you're like given portions of water that you're allowed to use, depending on the size of land that you have. And there's like all these rules and regulations and stuff. And there's even an elected individual called the mayordomo, who's like in charge of that specific acequia and setting up the tequios to have it cleaned and stuff. So it's like this very rigid system of governance. But yeah, during that period of my life, that was cool, opening it up and seeing that water come gushing out and filling up our field. And then I'd go out there and I'd close it. And every year, we'd go out there and have to help clean it. So that was very cool, man. It's just like, when they say water is life, like people understand that in the sense of like, well, yeah, obviously water is life. I got to drink water to live. But when you're like growing stuff and you're eating what you're growing, it takes on like this whole different meaning, And then when you've got an entire community that's doing that and sustaining themselves off of it, then like, yeah, water is life. And here in New Mexico, we had just a week ago, we had like these 3 massive fires. I don't know if they're still even going. We had one in the Bosque down by Peralta, where I used to live. We had one in southern New Mexico and one in northern New Mexico. And it's so dry here. Like, we're in the middle of a really devastating drought. And through my job, I've worked most of the forests in New Mexico for like months at a time. And I would come back and I would always tell my wife, like, these forests are tinderboxes. Like, there's just deadfall everywhere. And, you know, we were out there doing what's called a CFRP, which means a collaborative fuel reduction program. So different government agencies were collaborating, and they were going to go in there and try to clear out all the deadfall. They
don't try to
fuel
do
reduction,
like controlled fires to try to get rid of some of that.
So that's part of it, but it was either they would do a controlled burn, or they were going to open it up to allow people to go up and collect firewood. Mm-hmm. So, or like some big corporation was going to come in and log, right? So there were all of these different reasons for doing a CFRP. Our job was to go out there and make sure that no cultural resources were going to be destroyed as a result of these activities. So we'd have to go out there and identify archaeological sites and then write up reports that the best way to preserve these sites, try to protect them. But I saw it firsthand, man. These places they're tinderboxes, and we're in the middle of this horrible drought. So acequias now more than ever are important in New Mexico. And now it's just going to be all about water. Like, this state is hurting.
What is the historical importance of the acequias to New Mexico?
Well, I think it just comes down to, you have these small communities, mainly in northern New Mexico, where a lot of these acequia communities still exist. But even here in Albuquerque, there's acequia communities within the city itself, right? In like the South Valley. What's interesting is one of them is Atrisco, which is Atlixco, which is a Nahuatl name. It was like one of the earliest settlements of New Mexico, colonial settlements, and it has a Nahuatl name. But so people, you know, every year they have these a blessing of the waters. So like the communities will come out. There'll be danzantes there. There'll be matachines there. There's the church shows up, the Catholic priests, and there's like this ceremony to bless the waters that year. And it's on the Saint, I can't remember his name. Is it San Ignacio? I think so. But he's like the patron of ditches, basically.
Okay. I had no idea there was a patron of ditches.
Yeah, and what's cool is in Mexico City, you'll find images of him that have been repurposed into images of Tlaloc.
What?
Yeah.
That's different?
San Isidro. San Isidro, that's his name.
So I'm trying to get at something here. You have the word Atrisco, which comes from Atlixco. Then you have the word Tequio, which, I mean, I think that's just the basic Nahuatl Tequio, right? Community work. And yes, I get that the Spanish adopted acequia for the way Napantlis, but I'm curious as to why, of all the words that they're going to import from the old world to label something, they're going to go with that one, but everything else is going to be Nahuatl, or, you know.
It's weird. And that's one thing that I point out with the word tortilla, too. Like, the most common of our foods, all of our other foods retain like a Nahuatl name or an indigenous-based name, except for the most ubiquitous form of our food has a Spanish name. Like, it trips me out. And the same thing with acequia, right? So like all of this part of the, the tapanco, the apantle, the tequio, but the word itself is still Spanish or a Spanishized version of an Arabic word.
Mm-hmm.
So here I see, I pulled up Albuquerque Journal. Communities in New Mexico still follow centuries-old traditions that came from Spain. Yeah, whatever. With ceremonial blessings for the waterways that give life to crops. Yeah, because only the Spaniards had ceremonies for waterways that gave life to crops.
Or only the
right?
Spanish could think of making ditches for water.
Yeah, right. How hard is that? It's pretty basic. In the honor of the May 15th feast of San Isidro, patron saint of laborers and farmers. So that's what he is, laborers and farmers.
So
With
he's the
processions,
saint of the
singing,
tequio.
dancing, and a blessing of local acequias. So it's actually pretty cool to watch because, like I said, all these different groups come out. Pueblo people come out, matachines, danzantes, and they all participate in this blessing of the acequias. But then, of course, Albuquerque Journal story repeats the same bullshit. Spanish settlers who came to New Mexico 400 years ago brought the tradition of building irrigation waterways. It's like, yeah, because nobody else thought of irrigation. It's crazy.
Water, how does that work?
Well, the thing is, here in New Mexico, man, it's like an uphill battle to convince people that adobe already existed before the Spanish came.
Wait, who says that it didn't?
Here in New Mexico, that's what you're taught. You're taught here in New Mexico that the Spaniards brought the technology of adobe.
Brought it from where, though?
That they learned it from the Moors.
From the Moors? The Moors didn't even make adobe. Did they? I mean...
Yeah, no, they did. The ovens... Yeah, the hornos, that's definitely from
But adobe
from the
is,
Muslims.
adobe is an indigenous technology to the Americas.
So what they brought, and it's funny because if you parse it a certain way, they might technically be right, because what the Spaniards brought was the use of hay to add.
So they just
to the adobe.
They added
an ingredient, and now they're credited with inventing the entire. But go to Paquimé in Chihuahua.
Go to my dad's hometown. I mean, what are you talking about? All the houses, at least the old ones that still exist, are all made of adobe. I used to watch people make adobe in my dad's hometown. Like, I've seen it done, and I even participated in like the making of it, when I was a little kid.
Yeah, I've made some adobe. I'm not any good at it.
And let me tell you, it wasn't some Spanish thing. I mean, it's definitely indigenous.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you look at just Paquimé, like I said, you have an entire city that's built of adobe.
Right.
But they want to ignore all of that to credit it that. And you know why? Because for the most part, mainstream Hispanophile New Mexicans are afraid of the truth. And you know what I say about the truth?
Something about medicine, right?
Yeah. The truth is like medicine, my brother. Doesn't always taste good.
Sometimes it tastes funky, and sometimes it don't.
But it's always good for you. Timo Itase. Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis. Please check out our website and consider becoming a Patreon supporter. Tlaskamati.
Booyah.
San Isidro Labrador, San Isidro Labrador, San Isidro Labrador. Es Tlaloc mi señor, le canto la alabanza que yo le debía a Tlaloc mi señor y a San Isidro Labrador. San Isidro Labrador, San Isidro Labrador, San Isidro Labrador. Es Tlaloc mi señor, bendice la semilla y bendice la cosecha, bendice el santo fruto de esta buena tierra. Isidro Labrador, San Isidro Labrador, San Isidro Labrador. Es Tlaloc mi señor, bendícenos con lluvia y bendícenos la siembra, bendícenos la agüita que corre en la acequia. San Isidro Labrador, San Isidro Labrador, San
Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoitase. Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoitase.